Welcome back to the Bilbao European Encounters. On behalf of the Governance Institute for Democratic Governance and the European Institute of the London School of Economics, I welcome you to this panel, Building Up a Shared European Socio-Political Framework Beyond the Legitimacy Debate, with Adriana Chancho and José Luis Martí. Both speakers will have approximately 20 minutes or so, approximately, for their presentations, and the remaining time will be left for your debate and questions for our speakers. So first, I'd like to introduce you to Adriana Chancho. Adriana is a professor in constitutional law at the University of Catania in Italy, also visiting professor of the Faculty of Law and Administration at the University of Warsaw in Poland, author of many publications on topics of EU constitutional law and matters of European integration. Her presentation today is a new uniform electoral procedure to re-legitimize the process of political integration in Europe. Adriana.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all the organizers of this important conference, and especially Professor Inerarity and Professor White for their kind invitation to be here with you to discuss on this topic, blazing the trail of a new narrative for a new Europe. But I also have to apologize myself because I've realized that my presentation takes about 23, maybe 24, even 25 minutes. That's why I don't want to waste any more precious time, so let me kick off my presentation posing a question strictly related to the title I've chosen for my talk. The question is, in what sense the process of political integration in Europe should be relegitimated? Isn't it legitimate anymore? Or perhaps, isn't it legitimate enough? From a perspective of constitutional law that is my own, it's clear that the issue I'm referring to with this question is the well-known, persistent, inadequate democratic legitimacy of the Union's decision-making process that seems has not yet been resolved in spite of the strengthening of the role of the Parliament after the entry into force of the Treaty of Lisbon and the new rules on the functioning of the Union. Indeed, it is certain that major progress has been made on this issue compared to the previous treaties, fundamentally as a result of the expansion of the legislative powers of the Parliament, which, I remind to myself, is the only European institution with direct democratic legitimacy and which has now gained an equal status as co-legislator with the Council in most areas of the Union's policy. So democracy seems to be respected, at least from a formal point of view, as it has long been argued by, for example, Hans Kelsen, by who finds the essence of democracy in the circumstance that in the very heart of the political decision-making process, the constitutional setting provides bodies whose members are directly elected by the citizens through their votes, and thus are representative of the people. But it is this very same notion of political representation and the concept of representativeness which, when transposed to European level, show some symptoms of tension due to certain issues which have yet to be resolved. The first issue concerns the failure to consolidate, as already said Lina before, the failure to consolidate a structured and stable system of genuinely European political parties, thereby definitely removing election campaigns and more generally the entire management of European elections from the control of national political parties to which they have been entrusted to date. In spite of the recent considerable progress in this direction provided by the rules about the statute and founding of European political parties adopted in 2003, amended a first time in 2007 and then again in 2014, with the aim to grant European political parties a uniform European legal personality, European politics still lacks that natural interface between voters and institutions that is traditionally provided by parties, conveying the political will of the electorate into decision-making bodies according to a particular view of the general interest of the Union, in opposition to specific local interests which MEPs are still tempted to represent due to the fact that, so far, they are still nominated for election by national parties. This peculiarity acts as a brake on the process of political integration in Europe. In fact, the different visions about and interesting concerning Europe itself, its role in the global context, its policies, its future, and so on, are not presented to the electorate in the run-up to the European elections. Rather, election campaigns are played first and foremost in the national political arenas, leaving electors in the dark about the actual union policies that would result from their votes. Notwithstanding the fact that the Treaty of Lisbon has changed the mandate of MEPs, making them direct representatives of the union citizens instead of representatives of the peoples of the states brought together in the community as previously laid down by the treaty establishing the European community. So far, however, European citizens still vote for the European Parliament through national parties instead of real European parties. It represents a sharp contrast to the nature itself of the Parliament as a truly European body and an equal co-legislator in the European Union's institutional setup. Actually, there have been only weak positive signs to announce the creation of a European political party system dating to 2014 before the parliamentary elections in the form of candidature for the post of Commission President proposed jointly by national political parties with political affinities as a sign of shared transnational policies. Actually, it acted as a reinforcement of the political role of the Parliament in its relationship both with the Council, due to the fact that the Treaty of Lisbon gave the European Parliament the right to elect the Commission President instead of merely giving its consent to the Council's choice, and furthermore, with the Commission itself, in line with a more parliamentarian type of governance of the EU. However, despite all efforts, the leading candidates were unknown to the majority of Union citizens, and for many voters, even the affiliation of the national parties to the European families was unclear or even unknown. The second major unresolved issue, closed links to the first, relating to the essence of the representative relationship, concerns the persistent lack of a uniform electoral system for the European Parliament, despite a long-standing exhortation from the European institutions. Whilst this admonishment has subsequently been expressed legally since the Treaty of Rome itself, that already envisaged the possibility of elaborating a uniform electoral procedure based on indirect universal suffrage to current Article 223, their implementation has not progressed beyond the formulation of certain highly general and commonly shared principles, which have been incorporated in single acts of national legislation, among which the main one is the choice for a proportional electoral system. But no comprehensive agreement on a truly uniform electoral procedure has yet been achieved, and only some convergence of electoral systems has taken place gradually among member states as a result of the adoption of secondary legislation. The only reform of the Electoral Act dates back to 2002, requiring member states to abolish the dual mandate for MEPs and to conduct elections on the basis of proportional representation using a list system or a single transferable vote system. It means that up until now, the political distribution of seats in the European Parliament is not determined by one true European election, but rather through 28 national elections. But to give effectiveness, as I have already argued several times, to the European democracy, what should be presented to all European voters are unitary lists of candidates, grouped on the basis of shared European political programs elaborated by actual European political parties, and elected on the basis of a uniform electoral procedure across the whole Union within transnational constituencies. Nevertheless, up until now, European elections are still governed for the most part by national laws, electoral campaigning remains national, and European political parties are still too weak, being only the projection outside the institution of political groups existing inside the Parliament by their union of MEPs sharing only some generic political affinities to fulfill their constitutional mandate and contribute to forming European political awareness and to expressing the will of citizens of the Union as required by Article 10 of the Treaty of Lisbon. The outcomes of the above-described system of European election is that even if the democratic legitimacy of the Parliament and more widely democracy itself is formally respected at European level, it probably lacks effectiveness. Indeed, elections are the main instrument of democratic participation, but the current functioning of European elections points out to an unbridgeable gap between the electorate and the European Parliament, exacerbated by the fact that the Union citizens are still unable to fully take part in European political debates. This gap contributes to explain the trouble which Europeans have in understanding and hence living to the full of their own status as European citizens, alongside the traditional citizenships of their respective countries of origin. It also contributes to explain the widespread skepticism for the process of political integration in Europe that led in May 2014 to the most anti-European parliament ever elected in history since 1979, year, as everybody knows, of the first direct election of this institution. This comes in conjunction with a recent increase in mutual distrust between citizens of countries that are still economically stable and those whose countries run large budget deficits, along with the complaints from both groups of citizens, although for opposite reasons, towards technocrat decisions taken in Brussels. Actually, the common perception is that in the EU there is still too much technocracy, too much bureaucracy, too much lobbying, and too little politics, as clearly shown also during the last Greek crisis in July 2015, when the Parliament seemed to have disappeared from the scene and left at the corner in the complex management of the crisis when other institutions with no political legitimacy and low accountability played the role of main characters, firstly among them the European Central Bank. To win back European citizens' trust towards the Union, it is necessary to place politics at the core of the decision-making process in Europe through the Parliament itself, which, being the only political body directly elected, must necessarily be granted public policy decision powers. However, such evolution cannot take place unless the Parliament becomes substantially representative of the political will of the European voters through a major strengthening of the European dimension of European elections. The alternative is the spreading social perception of an irreversible decline of the European Union, perception which is fostering the rise of populism, nationalism, and xenophobia as the big challenges of immigration and international terrorism are showing right now. So, it is urgent to relegitimate the process of political integration in Europe, mainly giving a new meaning to the European political elections. It's time for a new narrative for the European elections themselves. From this perspective, there are big hopes for the proposal for amending the Act of 1976 concerning the election of the MEPs, approved by the European Parliament last November 11th, and addressed to the Council for the final decision. Using its power laid down by Article 223 of the Treaty on Functioning of the Union, the Parliament decided to initiate a reform of its electoral procedure in good time before the 2019 elections, with the ambitious aim of enhancing the democratic and transnational dimension of the European election and the democratic legitimacy of the Union decision-making process, reinforcing the concept of citizenship of the Union and electoral equality, promoting the principle of representative democracy and the direct representation of Union citizens in the European Parliament, improving the functioning of the European Parliament and the governance of the Union, making the work of the European Parliament more legitimate and efficient, enhancing the effectiveness of the system for conducting European elections, fostering common ownership among citizens from all member states, enhancing the balanced composition of the European Parliament, and providing for the greatest possible degree of electoral equality and participation for citizens of the Union. Actually, a big part of the proposed reforms concerns the need to ensure that European citizens exercise their right to vote and to stand as a candidate in elections for the EU Parliament under comparable conditions across member states, in accordance with democratic principles and equality above all, irrespective both of their national citizenship and their country of residence. Indeed, even though European citizenship includes in itself the right of Union citizens to participate in European elections in any member state of residence under the same conditions as national of that state, different national electoral rules still make the effective implementation of this principle problematic at best. Well, I give many examples, but I don't have enough time, so you can read later in my paper. There are several new rules submitted to the Council for approval by unanimity and then to be ratified by the Member States according to their respective constitutional requirements, concern the right of all European citizens to participate in the democratic life of the Union on an equal basis, also between men and women. With this goal, the Parliament determines the introduction of a common deadline of 12 weeks before Election Day for establishing lists at the national level in order to enhance electoral equality by providing candidates and voters across the Union with the same period to prepare and reflect ahead of the vote. Likewise, the introduction of a common deadline of 8 weeks before the first election day for finalizing their electoral rules. The introduction of an obligatory threshold ranging between 3% and 5% for the allocation of seats. This measure, in particular, is important to avoid further fragmentation and therefore to safeguard the functioning of the Parliament. Furthermore, the Parliament suggests Member States to allow postal, electronic, and internet voting in order to increase participation in the election of even more citizens, as well as making it easier, especially for people with reduced mobility and for those living or working in a Member State of which they are not citizens or in a third country, provided that also appropriate measures are introduced both to prevent any fraud in using these new means of voting and to ensure reliability of the results, secrecy of the vote, and data protection. Indeed, the Parliament proposes that all Union citizens, including those living or working in a third country, be granted the right to cast their vote in elections for the European Parliament by encouraging Member States to take adequate measures to ensure the exercise of these rights. However, urging Member States to coordinate their administrative systems in order to prevent voters from voting twice in two different Member States. Moreover, the Parliament highlights the importance of an increased presence of women in political decision-making and consequently encourages Member States to take measures to promote gender equality throughout the whole electoral process, underlining the need of gender-balanced electoral lists. As a future step, it is also recommends that Member States consider the possibility to harmonize the legal age for voters at 16 in order to further enhance electoral equality among Union citizens and, moreover, to increase the interest in European issues among the youngest voters. Other provisions concern the requirement to harmonize the time for closing the polling in all Member States and correspondingly the time of communicating the first official projection of results to avoid influencing the final result of elections. New incompatibilities for the maps are also introduced. Furthermore, the necessity to ensure democratic and transparent procedure for the selection of candidates by all the political parties is also required. Well, at a first sight, the proposed change to the 1976 Electoral Act, finally approved by the Parliament, among the broad number of potential reform measures scrutinized by the co-reporters who were delegated for the final report, could appear not so revolutionary as the solemn statement at the end of the preliminary examination the Committee on Constitutional Affairs led to imagine. So we could ask, much ado about nothing? Actually, in relation to the initial point of view of this presentation, the approved resolution seems to me quite important. Indeed, it shows the will to enhance the connection that ought to exist between the electoral procedure for the European Parliament and the role of European political parties in the management of elections, with the aim to strengthen democratic development and political integration in Europe, without forgetting the new rules for the choice of the President of the European Commission, now strictly dependent on the result of election as enshrined in the Treaty of Lisbon. From this perspective, the drafters have highlighted the need to show the voters during all the campaigns for parliament elections the true political meaning of their vote beyond the choice for a particular national party, due to the connection between the vote itself and its impact on the size of a European political group inside the parliament, as well as implicitly on the election for the presidency of the European Commission. For these reasons, it has been argued that the procedure for the selection of the leading candidates for this position should be an integral part of the election campaigns, constituting an important aspect of it. because the nomination both provides a link between voters cast at the national level and the European dimension, and enables European citizens to be informed about alternative political programs. Furthermore, the designation of leading candidates for the office of President of the Commission by open and transparent procedures reinforces democratic legitimacy and strengthens accountability. Consequently, it has been urged that a common deadline for the nomination of candidates by European political parties should be codified in the Electoral Act. This term has been set in 12 weeks in advance of elections, so as to enable the presentation of electoral programs to the voters and the organization of political debates among the candidates. Moreover, since European political parties are best placed to contribute to forming European political awareness, they should therefore play a stronger role in the whole management of European elections, and their visibility should be increased. With this aim, it has been established to place their names and logos on the ballot papers and wherever possible on posters and other materials used in election campaigns in conjunction with those of national parties affiliated with them. This kind of arrangements is mainly addressed to highlight the link between national parties and the big European political families, since those measures would make European elections more transparent and improve the democratic way in which they are conducted, as citizens will be able to clearly connect their vote to the impact it has on the political influence of European political parties and their ability to form political groups inside the Parliament. For the same reasons, the Member States are now encouraged to facilitate the provision of those affiliation on television and in other media, and electoral campaign materials shall include a reference to the manifesto of the European political party, if any, to which the national party is affiliated. Last, but surely not least, a notable amendment to the 1976 Electoral Act is laid down in Article 2A of the approved resolution, establishing that the Council decides by unanimity on a joint constituency in which lists are headed by each political family's candidate for the office of President of the Commission. Actually, from my perspective, as I argued before, this is precisely the rule that would both greatly strengthen European democracy, boosting the role of the European political parties in the elections, and also mostly contribute to create a pan-European moment, enhancing the common European character of the European elections. Indeed, this purpose would be further served by lists of candidates evenly led by the leaders of the big European political families competing for the president post within a joint constituency. Probably this would be only an initial step to provide a new meaning for the European elections, but nevertheless, it seems to me that, if finally approved by the Council, it could represent a good starting point to blaze the trail of a new narrative for a new Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Chancho, for your intervention and also for giving us constructive steps and ideas on how to construct a uniform electoral procedure in the goals of re-legitimizing the political integration of the European Union, very closely linked to the ideas that will be now exposed by our second speaker, José Luis Martí, whether or not there is a European demos or a no demos. A couple words on Professor Martí. Professor Martí teaches in the Faculty of Legal Philosophy at the University of Pompeu Fabra in Catalonia. He's also was a fellow at the University Center for Human Values, Princeton University, also a visiting professor at the University of Richmond. Professor Martí is the chief editor for the review Law, Ethics, and Philosophy. Welcome, and you have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you all. I think I will say Kaixo and Egunon. I will say it very badly, but that's the only two words that I can say in Basque, which means hello, good morning, and hello. So I'm a philosopher, I'm sorry about that, and the kind of presentation that I will make now is basically philosophical, right? I'm sorry to come at the very end of the session of the workshop with these highly abstract ideas. I feel that The things I want to say complement quite well with what Adriana has said. She has dealt with the interesting issues. I will deal with the uninteresting issues. But basically what I will do is what philosophers can do reasonably well, if they can do something reasonably well, which is try to clarify some concepts. I think Danielle invited us actually to produce new narratives, new concepts, new ideas. And I think I will discuss actually a very old argument in the literature about the European Union, but I will do it basically with the aim of clarifying some concepts in a way that can be useful actually to current discussion. So the argument I want to discuss, the non-demos thesis, as it has been called, fits in the context, in the background of a very old literature dealing with the famous democratic deficit of the EU, right? So I will not spend any time in explaining this idea, but as most of you probably know, there's a bunch of people, many people who have been claiming from quite a long time now, have been claiming that the EU is insufficiently democratic, right? So we have been delegating power on and on to the European Union, but this power is insufficiently democratic, or it's not sufficiently accountable, or it's not sufficiently transparent, or the people have no sufficient power to participate in making decisions about all this power that has been delegated. Of course, some people reject this idea. I mean, it's very well known that, for instance, Andrew Morabsik has been trying to resist the idea that there is a democratic deficit, but I would say quite a lot of, the majority of people who have discussed this idea agree that there is a democratic deficit of one kind or another, right? So some people think that the democratic deficit derives from the inexistence of an empowered legislative parliament, right? That the legislative power at best is divided between the Parliament and the Commission. Others think that it comes from the lack of a democratically elected executive. Others think that the problem is actually in our national democracies. But many have said also that the problem is the inexistence of a single European demos. And this has been, as I said, this has been known by many people as the no demos thesis, right? So this is a standard name. And as I said, it's quite popular, or it has been quite popular among many students of European Union. And it's a very old concept. It has more than 20 years that it has been discussing, but for some reason, it still attracts some philosophers and some experts on the European Union, right? So for instance, Bellamy in two recent papers have argued similarly along the lines of the no demos thesis with some specificities, but basically with the same intuition, right? So it's a very old thesis, but it's still on track, and it still attracts a lot of people. I think one of the reasons why the thesis is still attractive is that the thesis is quite beautiful, actually, if I may say it in that way. So I think it's, on the one hand, it's a very simple thesis, right? I will reconstruct it in a minute. I think it's very simple, apparently at least. It's very simple. It promises to be normatively neutral, right? So it's basically conceived as an empirical thing, basically. So in principle, does not depend on any concrete normative view or any concrete theory of justice or any concrete theory of democracy that you may have. But regardless of your opinions or your ideology, so this is supposed to be a problem, and a very important problem. Another source of attractiveness is that it's supposed to be a democratic argument, right? So it's an argument to say that democracy is impossible in Europe, but it's a democratic argument. It's not that they want to discuss that democracy is valuable, right? That we should go for different kinds of government. No, democracy is valuable, but it's simply impossible in Europe. But despite being simple, and despite being neutral, and despite being democratic, it's supposed to have an extraordinary force, right? So it's intended to be a blocking argument. If the no demos thesis is right, then democracy is not possible in Europe, so we should not spend time actually discussing how to democratize Europe and how to build democratic politics at the European level. So let me reconstruct the no demos thesis in its simplest formulation. I think it starts with a definition, right? Quite specific, not very controversial. Very minimal, right, of democracy. Democracy means the government of the people and by the people. Miguel was saying yesterday that he didn't understand what democracy of the people is. I think there's a way of understanding, but we can discuss it in the debate. But that's a very well-known definition of democracy. It tracks to Lincoln, was supposed to be the one who made it for the first time, and it's quite uncontroversial, stated in these terms. From this definition, we can extract an implication, which is, therefore, the existence of a demos is a necessary condition for having democracy. You cannot have democracy if you don't have a demos, right? Because, again, democracy is a government of the people, of the demos, right? So you need to have a demos first. Then we have another premise, which is supposed to be empirical in principle, and this premise, which is, of course, the key one, is that there is no single European demos, right? There is no such a thing. There's a sum of different demoi, right? So if every national state has a demos, but there is no such a thing as the European demos. And not only this, it's not only that we don't have it today, but it's very difficult or even impossible to have it in the near future, right? Of course, if it were easy actually to have a European demos tomorrow, then the no demos thesis wouldn't be interesting. But the thing is, they presuppose that's something very, very difficult or nearly impossible to have in the near future. And from these premises, right, the conclusion is, of course, that democracy is not possible at the European level, at least in the near future, right? So democracy is not possible. Let's save our time. Let's not discuss about how to democratize the European Union, because that's actually impossible. That's the thesis in its simplest formulation. As I said, the key premise here is the alleged empirical assumption, right, that there is no single European demos, and let me try to analyze it with some detail. So one of the beauties, as I said, one of the beauties of the thesis is that it's supposed to be normatively neutral, right? So the idea of a demos, in principle, is supposed to be quite a neutral thing. It's just a conceptual matter, how to define a demos. And then, so the thesis is neutral to the ideology that you might have. I don't think that's true, actually. And for that reason, I don't think that the so-called empirical premise, I don't think it's empirical, right? So I think it's normatively charged. And actually, of course, whether it's true that there is or not a European demos depends crucially on what we mean by the demos, right? So everything in the no demos thesis depends on how we understand the idea of a demos. So what is a demos, right? And here, all the problems arise, right? So a demos, the idea of a demos is far from simple, right? It's not a simple idea. In the history of democratic theory, it's not a simple idea at all. And it's far from pacific, right? So you may find basically different understandings, and it's not obvious what of them is the correct one. And it's certainly not a purely conceptual or purely empirical question, right? So it's not identifying whether there is a European demos or not is not like identifying whether there is a mountain in front of us here, right? So it's far more complicated than that. A demos is, of course, a group of people, right? So we can start from this. It's a group of people, a collective of human beings. But that is not enough, right? So not every group of people is a demos, right? When we use the word demos, we refer to the people, right? Not to a group of people, but the people, right? Which is something different, right? So what distinguishes a group of people from the people is, among many other things, is that when we talk about the people, we talk about something that is political, right? Groups of people might have different nature, but a demos has a political nature. That's, I think, essential. And what do we mean by political? Well, I think that political might mean many things, but one of the things that it certainly means is that a demos is a group of people that is capable of governing itself, right, of self-government. That doesn't mean that every demos actually achieves self-government, right? Because we know many political communities are not democratic. But a demos is a group that needs to be capable of self-government, because otherwise it's not a demos, right? It's not political enough. So if a collective of people is not capable of self-government, then the conditions for democracy do not obtain. And then it's when we can say we don't have a demos, right? And now the question is whether this happens or not at the European level. But first, we need to know what does it mean that a group of people has this capacity of self-government or capacity to govern itself. Well, first of all, the capacity needs to be understood in very minimal conditions, right? So there might be many, many different conditions that might strengthen the capacity of a group of people to govern itself, right? Of course. And this can be as demanding as you want. But the thing is, when we talk about the conceptual thesis of from what point we can start talking about having a demos, we need to refer to a very minimal thing. Because we want to say, right, for instance, that's the example that I will be using quite often in my talk. We want to say that when the United States seceded from the UK in the 18th century and formed the first modern democracy, we want to say that they were a demos, right? And of course, they had many problems, right? But we want to say that they were a demos, because otherwise we should say that they didn't construct the first modern democracy, right? And that's something we want to say. So, or even, we can go even farther, right? So we want to say that when the ancient Rome went from monarchy to a republic, right? We want to say that that was, I mean, in some way, very, very primary, very basic, but in some way that was a passage from a monarchy to a democracy. Very imperfect, right? Of course, very imperfect, excluding a large amount of population and so on. But nevertheless, we want to say that they were sufficiently a demos, to go from monarchy to a republic. So, what are the requirements that we might impose to a group of people actually to consider it a political group of people and then a demos? Well, here are two requirements that I think would be specific, right? So first of all, these people should have some minimal epistemic and psychological human capacities, right? So we wouldn't say that a group of insane people could form a demos. That's, I think, quite clear. But that's very specific. That doesn't make a problem, especially in the European Union. We might be very crazy people, but not that crazy. And I think that, so in this sense, that cannot be the problem, the obstacle for forming a European demos. A second condition might be more problematic. So a second condition, I think, and we can discuss it in the Q&A, but a second condition is that a group of people, in order to become a demos, must want to become a demos, right? It needs this volitional element. I don't think the democracy can be imposed. I think that an imposed democracy is a contradictio in termini, right? It's a self-contradiction. I think that democracy, the way I understand democracy, requires necessarily that the people who self-govern do it freely, right? And then they must be free, actually, to reject democracy also. So I think that this element, of course, I will discuss it later, but I think this might be problematic at the European level. But we need something else, something more, right? So these two elements are not sufficient. What else can be required? And here, you have very different responses, right? So different understandings of what is a demos and different understandings of democracy in the end will come with different responses to what else, what other requirement we should impose to a demos, a group of people to be a demos, right? Different candidates for this third element. And we can distinguish basically four main conceptions. I will go quickly through this because that's not the core of the argument. So first of all, some people might say, nobody that I know say it, but anyway, some people might say, a demos is a collective of people that share the same legal status of citizenship, as simple as that, right? So if you have the status of citizenship, this legal connection with the others, then you have formed a demos. Then the definition would be, of course, circular, right? So the demos, because the legal provision, the legal tie that we conceive as citizenship must be given by someone, and this someone must be a demos, and then you have, of course, the problem of circularity, which is not on itself very problematic, because whenever we deal with the idea of a demos, we always find paradoxes everywhere. So in a way, that's not a definitive argument against it. But a definitive argument against it in this context is that, of course, that's not what we are missing at the European level, right? We have a European citizenship. We already have this a tie with other Europeans. So if this is what we mean by a demos, then we have a European demos. Then the no demos thesis is wrong, and we should not be worried about it. A second conception is what I call the political demos, right? A collective of people that share, so this is a pre-legal notion, right? So we need some kind of pre-legal notion. And some way of understanding is, what we need is some kind of political principles, right? And then, so many people have actually defended this, right? So people like Habermas, Rawls, Dworkin, and many others have said, all what we need is some shared agreement on some principles. Alessandro was trying yesterday to define the the core political identity of Europe around 7 constitutional essentials. Well, that's one example in this attempt, right? So then the people must achieve some agreement on such basic, broad constitutional principles. But this has problems, right? So first, it's not obvious how much, how wide, and how deep agreement we need to create a democracy. It's not clear what is a precondition of democracy in this language, and what is just a contributing factor for the quality of democracy. Maybe having a substantive agreement on many principles can be fantastic in order to give stability and quality to our democracy. But maybe that's not enough to say that this is a precondition of democracy. I'll skip some of the objections. A third conception is the pre-political demos. And then some people say, and that's probably the most common case in those who endorse the no demos thesis, most people might say that to form a demos you need something else, something that needs to be not only pre-legal but also pre-political, some kind of different identity, common identity, that might be understood in terms of common ethnic or common cultural elements or common religion or common self-identification. You can be very vague here, but you need some kind of self-identification, right? So Neus was referring yesterday to the works of liberal nationalists or David Miller, for instance, when they think that a precondition of cooperation is that people need to feel in the same boat and need to feel basically this, to identify themselves as part of the same group, right? So this also has problems, but I will skip them because I will turn to discuss the concrete objections that they address to the idea of a European democracy at the end. And finally, there's a fourth conception, which is what I call the pragmatic demos, right? So people like Samantha Besson or Jeremy Waldron, not in relation to Europe, but in general, or people, if I understand correctly what Daniel has said in a recent paper, people like Daniel has tried to make a case for something more pragmatic, right? All what we need to form a demos is, in addition to having the will to form it, right? Having so wanting to form a demos. In addition to that, all what we need is just that the circumstances of politics, in the expression of Waldron, obtain. And these are basically that we need to make decisions together and that we disagree about what is the best decision to be made. If this is obtained and we want to form a demos, then we have a demos, and there's nothing else. So don't ask about sharing identity or about sharing values. All these might come later, if we succeed in producing consensus through democratic procedures or not. But we don't need it conceptually, right, to have a demos. So I think that it's important to distinguish, as I already mentioned, it's important to distinguish what can be a precondition of democracy, right, and what can be a contributing factor to the quality of democracy. Many of the elements or many of the claims that have been made by those who endorse the no demos thesis can be fairly seen as conditions, contributing factors to the quality of democracy. But it's very difficult actually to understand them as preconditions of democracy, right? If we just pay attention to the existing democracies in the world, we will see that many of them have multiple identities, cultural diversity, plurinationalities. So they don't presuppose many of the conditions that these scholars require from the European Union, right? So it's difficult actually to accept the argument just as a conceptual thing, right? So that as a matter of impossibility. So then we can say that a well-functioning democracy may depend on very different conditions that are not conceptual preconditions, but that they might be important for giving value to democracy. And we should then reformulate the no demos thesis in a more complex way. Then now it's not so simple, right? We should say something like, democracy means the government of the people, and by the people, that's the same. A demos that does not meet certain empirical requirements cannot work properly. We might also add, below certain threshold, a demos that does not work properly is not able for governing itself. And then we might add the alleged empirical assumption, these empirical requirements do not obtain and will not obtain in the near future in the EU, and therefore the European demos cannot work properly and is not able for governing itself. And then a valuable democracy in Europe is not possible. That is a very different formulation of the no demos thesis. And as I said, it's not so simple, the force is not so devastating, and then when we address the no-demos thesis in this way, we are involved in a different kind of debate, right? Which is the debate that I basically engage in the final part of the paper, and I will summarize now in 1 minute, if I still have 1 minute. I will not be able to go into the details, but I want to give you a glimpse of the kind of argument that I want to engage at the end of the paper. So this is so far I've been basically making conceptual clarification, right, about what is the thesis, how we can understand it correctly, and so on. My proposal is the no-demos thesis should be renamed, right? It's not a no-demos thesis, it's a no-good demos thesis or something like this, right? No good democracy thesis or something like this. So then when we ask, well, okay, what are the conditions that make a democracy valuable? Well, of course, this is an extremely complex question. To respond to this question, we need detailed and complex democratic theory. We cannot do it in a neutral way, right? And then, of course, from my favorite democratic theory, namely deliberative democracy, I can give you a list of requirements, right? But that's not, of course, what I will do now, and it's not the idea, in any case, when we discuss the no-demos thesis. So all these conditions, so we might find a lot of conditions, and there's no way of identifying them in a value-laden way, right? So I will concentrate in the last part of the paper. I will just mention them now here, and we'll give a couple of responses. But I will concentrate on 3 kinds of conditions. They are not exhaustive. This is not exhaustive of the kind of conditions that are necessary for giving value to democracy. But these are the kind of arguments that you can hear in those that argue for the no-demos thesis. So the first one, as I mentioned first, there's the lack, or there might be a lack of will among European citizens to form a European democracy, right? And if that is the case, then I concede, right? That's devastating. Then we should abandon the project of having a European democracy so far. The second is the lack of a common identity in different versions of the argument. And the third is the lack of a structural conditions or an infrastructure of democracy. So regarding the will to form a demos, so many believe that European citizens don't want to strengthen the European integration and to form a European democracy. And they cite different arguments. Right? They say there's a low turnout in European elections, there's poor knowledge and interest about the EU. Danielle conceptualized it as an intelligibility deficit. They also mentioned the example of European constitution, right? So, and they mention it as a failure example. I think it's a fantastic success. I think it was a fantastic success. We can discuss it in the discussion. And they cite some studies that apparently show that European citizens don't want actually to have a European democracy. But I think things are much more complicated. So first, European citizens have never been asked whether they want to democratize the power that has been already delegated, right? We never had this referendum in Europe. We never were asked more concrete things, as, for example, as whether we want to elect directly the president of the commission, right? So these kind of questions have never been asked to the people. Even if it's true that, in the case that they were asked, even if it's true that they would respond that they don't want a European democracy, well, we know that the degree of information that people have about the European Union is very low. So first of all, we should actually inform the people about what is the European Union, the importance that it has, and the many decisions that are being made in the European Union. And then I think, so the only way of giving value to what the people want to do is first paying attention to the conditions that make the judgment of the people valuable. And finally, even if it's true, as I said, if it's true that the people, once being informed and having a considered judgment, they reject the idea of having a European democracy, then I concede, as I said, we should not have a European democracy because democracy cannot be imposed. But this is only contingent, right? So this depends on the current response that might change in the future, especially with the new generations and the Erasmus babies as I was mentioning yesterday. So, well, I don't have time, but in the paper I discuss also the arguments of a lack of common identity. I think basically the summary is that I don't think that they are, in many cases, that they are necessary for democracy or even contributing factors to democracy. And I also discuss another argument that you can hear quite often, which is the lack of, for instance, a public sphere, or the lack of having common media, right, European-wide common media, or having European-wide civil society, right? These kind of arguments you can hear quite often. And again, in general, my general response is either they are exaggerated, so I don't think that we don't have anything, right? So we have something, and then it's a matter of degree whether we have more or less civil society, more or less a common public sphere. But the important thing is not this. The important thing is all these things develop with democracy, not before having democracy, right? So democracy self-reinforces and self-reinforce all these conditions. And the only way of developing these kind of things that are really necessary, and we should care about them if we want to build European democracy, the only way of developing all these things is actually by starting talking about democracy and by generating spaces of common decision-making. And I will stop here, and I'm happy actually to discuss with you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Martí. Before we open for your questions and comments, I'd like to first give an opportunity to either one of our speakers to comment or ask a question based on the intervention so far. If there aren't any, then I'd like to open it. At the moment, no. Perhaps with some inspiration from your questions, there will be more. So I'd like to open it now to the floor for any of your questions or thoughts. And perhaps maybe I'll get the ball rolling with the first question then, as a way to sort of maybe bridge. Oh, yes. I think we have a microphone. Thank you.
To the Parliament. I mean, a Parliament is useful, and a Parliament needs to be elected, and the idea to have common elections is a complicated one, as you explained. The more so since we have habits in organizing elections, and you won't convince the Brits easily to give theirs up and others and so on. These are difficulties. But the main problem I see is that we at the same time live in a period where ever more powers are taken away from parliaments anyway. So how happy can we be if you get through with your ideas?
Well, actually, my thought is only a piece of a complex idea because I think that we have to strengthen political union in the Eurozone with, as Professor Maduro said yesterday, for example, a fiscal capacity to the union, but this needs, of course, to rethink the whole institutional framework of the Eurozone. For example, we need, I think, a second chamber, because I don't remember who told yesterday, but it's so, maybe Fabrini, it's so strange that all the governments take decisions for the union, for the Eurozone member states, of course. So we have the Council of the Minister that is in a strange position right now. And we are discussing in Italy in the constitutional debate about the second chamber of the Eurozone, for the Eurozone, how it's necessary for the second chamber, for example, with delegation from national parliaments or directly elected by the citizens of the Eurozone, and the competences, of course, the powers of this second chamber. And then there is another very, very big problem, as you clearly know, that is the accountability, the law accountability of European Central Bank and more widely of technocrat institutions. So we are quite used to think to a technical legitimacy that is based on the provisions of the treaties and on constitutional rules, when there is a judge that controls the respect of these rules. And actually, at the European level, this kind of control acts, because as we could see with the judgment of Court of Justice on the outright monetary transaction. But the problem is that we also need a political legitimacy, and we have to combine the eventual political legitimacy of technocrat institutions with their independence, of course, but I think that this problem could be solved, as I tried to explain in that essay I gave you yesterday. I don't know. Thank you.
Other question?
Good morning to everyone. I have a question for the Professor Martí, and it's related with the idea about how to democratize the power that has been already delegated to the EU. And my question is, the first is, how is possible to do that in order to think in the new generations, but as well, what happened with the referendums in France and other countries that asked before to get into the EU as a complex unity? That's my question.
Yeah, so how to democratize, of course, that's a complex question. I cannot respond now in a simple response. But what I would say is quite along the lines that Adriana has been defending, right? So I think that it's critical. That's the last part of the paper that I couldn't address in detail now. But so it's critical actually to have European-wide elections with a European party system, right? Much stronger than what we have now, right? So it's not that we don't have European elections, but we should have real European debates, right? We should be discussing European things when we have European elections. We should, and so the reason why we don't have these is, again, is complex and depends on many factors, but one of the problems that I identify, especially when I discuss the identity precondition assumption, is that I don't think that we need a common identity in Europe, but what I certainly think we need, and I mentioned it briefly yesterday, is we should stop our existing nation-building programs at the national level, because I think that what they make, the effect of these programs that we can see in the education system and in many other examples, the effect of that is that still many people approach the European Union with the national lens, right? And I think that kills the idea of having European democracy. My response should be much longer than that, so I cannot go into the details. Regarding the Constitution, so I said that for me it was a history of success. I think that so, and that depends on the assumption that I defended before. I don't think that democracy can be imposed, right? And I don't think that further integration in Europe can be imposed if the people don't want it, right? So for me, a condition of the legitimacy of any step forward in the integration of Europe is that the people in Europe, or the peoples, first of all, in Europe, should want it, right? So, and I think that if you are a Democrat, right, so you need to celebrate the procedure, right, independently of the result. If the result is not what you want, well, you need to accept the result anyway, right? But I think, but that's one thing. But the second thing why I think that it was successful is that because of that failure, right, in constructing this European Constitution and so on, we became more aware than ever, right, that we have a problem in terms of explaining the European Union to the citizens and so on. Particularly in France, I cannot tell exactly about the Dutch case, but the French case, I followed it quite closely. And particularly in France, many people who opposed the European Constitution, they were not Eurosceptics, right? So they were not against the idea of having a European integration. They simply wanted a different kind of European integration, and I personally think they were right. It's not that I would have voted no, but that's very complex. But I think that, I mean, we need to analyze all these facts, right? And we need to give a proper response. But I don't think that we can just simply, so what I particularly reject is the reading of what happened as bringing us to the implication that then we should not consult the people anymore, right? So that's not something that we should actually leave to a decision of the people. I think that's a wrong implication.
Just a follow-up question for Professor Martí. When you talk about the national lens that prevent European democracy to actually work, if at all, what are you thinking? It's just a clarificatory question. What are you thinking about? Because it seems to me that this is quite of a controversial topic, since we are talking about a Europe of states and not a Europe of people. So we always are in the framework or depart from the framework of states. Something that maybe because many people here, many speakers are lawyers, they just give it like, for granted. Thank you. So are you, just to clarify, are you thinking about about some governing spheres that should be governed by the community instead of by the state. So to reduce the government feature of the state, or yeah, if you could clarify this lens.
Yes. So, as you know perfectly well, because you're writing a thesis on this, right? So there is a discussion about how to democratize the international level, right? The global level, let alone the European one. And so there are two approaches, right? Either you can go to find some kind of intergovernmental democracy, right? And of course, we're not at this stage anymore at the European Union, right? But maybe that might work at the global level. Or you try to have some kind of stronger, thicker democracy, right? If you, and all the intermediate ways are very dangerous, right? So dangerous because the link between the power of control by the citizens and the final decisions is broken, or it's very difficult to maintain, right? So then at the European level, either we stick with the intergovernmental paradigm, right? Which is of course not what we are discussing, right? But either we stick on this, and then the way in which the citizens of different countries can control the decisions made by Europe is mediated by their governments, right? And then we should actually give several steps back in the process of integration of Europe, because we left this kind of model quite a long time ago. Or we go for something new, right? And if we want to go for something new, then the requirements of a democracy, so-called democracy, is one of these requirements is that the people do not divide along the same groups for every decision, right? So in a democracy, for some decisions you will side with, with women. For some other decisions you will side with the leftist. For some other decisions you will side with whatever, right? But it's not, in a democracy, it's not that you always side with the same group. Now, if you approach European democracy as siding always with the same group, I give you an example. I'm Spanish, as you are. One of the hot issues in the European politics regarding Spain is what to do with the agrarian policy, right, with the PAC. And so agriculture is very strong in Spain, and there are many interests and so on. So then my politicians in Spain want to convince me that my interest as a Spanish citizen is to defend whatever in this issue, right? To defend the interest of the agriculture, the agrarian people in Spain. But why so? Why I should side with the Spanish government in the lobby in Europe to defend the interest of these people? Why should not align with the interest of the urban people in all across Europe, right? So, who might have different interests than those living in the countryside, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that one danger that I see in European democracy is that many people still approach it with this national lens. That's what gives meaning to everything, right? That's what illuminates the way in which you should behave in this European democracy. And I think that's antithetical with democracy itself.
I have two questions noted from, three then, from Undead Erasti, Daniel Inarariti, and Jonathan Weiss. Perhaps we'll do that in that order.
Yeah. I will be really short. The first one is a conceptual question, actually. You said that the national building is actually incompatible with the construction of a European democracy, and I was wondering whether you don't conceive, or it's not conceivable, to think about a national building which is actually somehow building a nation that implicitly is European also somehow. Couldn't it be the case that a French citizen, because of the nation building process on France, is actually a European citizen also? That would be the conceptual question. And the second, really shortly, you said at the end of your presentation that all those features that are required many times in order to have a democracy are actually the result, that democracy is prior to those features. And I was wondering, in your deliberative democracy account that you have presented, because in other forms of democracy I can perfectly agree with this without any further problem, but in the case of deliberative democracy, doesn't it have more specific requirements, such as a common media, such as common electoral basis and so on, which are much more demanding than in other accounts of democracy, and therefore how would it be possible to have a European deliberative democracy if there are no these features in advance?
So regarding the national identity thing, this gives me the opportunity to clarify what I said because I was very quick in this point. So what I find an obstacle to building a European democracy is the 19th century idea of national identity, right? So the one that is associated typically to the French nation building and so on, imposing one language, imposing one one single understanding of the public sphere and so on and so forth. And I think if that is exclusive, right? So this pretends to exclude the local identities as well as the transnational identities. And precisely because it's exclusive, it's an obstacle actually to build something else at the transnational level. But it's not opposed at any level actually about the local identities. I think actually that Catalans or Basques, we are used to live in a plurinational state, and so for us, nothing will change if we live in another plurinational state of European level, right? So, but the second thing, again, let me clarify this. So, the liberty of democracy is probably the most demanding ideal of democracy, right? So I don't know any other democratic theory that is more demanding than this. Does it mean that then it's totally impracticable, right? Unless we achieve fantastic conditions? Of course not. And many people actually ask, I mean, sometimes I've been asked, it is, right? So is the liberty of democracy possible in South America? For instance, I've been asked once whether it was possible in South America. And they said, I mean, you live in Europe, and in Europe you have, everything is fantastic, and then you can just spend time in deliberating. But here, I mean, we have real problems, they say, right? We have real problems. And so the conditions are not met, right? I think that's a false dichotomy, right? So if you go to a failing state with nothing working properly and so on, you can still starting a democratic decision-making. Of course, not of high value or not of super high value, right? Because the value of this process of democracy depends, in effect, on certain demanding conditions. But you can still start talking about democracy. So I don't think, I always rejected this idea that, that many economists, and not only economists, had, that, when you go to Africa, forget about democracy because the conditions for democracy are not given, right? What does it mean? That means that then we go to Africa and we impose authoritarian regimes. That's the implication. I reject this. So I think you can go there and start talking about democracy and, of course, care about the conditions that will make that democracy more valuable.
We have a question from Daniel.
This is also a remark or a question for José Luis. For me, the worst of the no demos thesis is not actually what it says, but what it takes for granted. Namely, that if there is no demos at the supranational level, there is a clear and controversial demos at nation-state level, and that is not always the case. It happens something similar with the question of the democratic deficit, as if problems of democracy appears only when we speak on the transnational level. And at the same time, we can take for granted that at the national level there is no democratic problems at all.
So thank you. I'm sorry to agree with you because then I cannot actually discuss what you're saying, but I totally agree. I actually use your argument because I learned a lot from your recent paper on this, and I use the argument that you make, right, when referring to plurinational democracies, right? So if you presuppose having a shared national identity, how can we explain plurinational democracies, right? So, and I would go even farther, right? So I use another argument that I think it's also clear, which is, and I briefly mentioned in my presentation, which is the argument of the forming United States of America, right? In the US on that time, in the 18th century, it's not that they had a common public sphere between all the states, right? I mean, there was no common media. The people were not traveling from one state to another to discuss their ideas. I mean, that didn't exist. But nobody said, we cannot go for a democratic government because these conditions are not given. Of course, they not even cared about these conditions. But I mean, retrospectively, we wouldn't say that they were not able actually to go for democracy because these conditions were not given. So I think I totally agree. And I agree also with the democratic deficit argument, with the only maybe caveat that I think that there's a difference of degree. It's only of degree, but it's an important degree, right? So we have a better democracy at the national level in Europe than the one that we have at the European level. It's not perfect, it's very far from perfect, and my demanding ideal of democracy makes it even more imperfect. But it's much better than the one that we have at the European level, which is practically non-existing.
Thank you. Again, a question for José Luis, and thank you very much for your presentation. I really felt like coming back in time 20 years ago when we were debating these questions, and I really abandoned them quite a long time ago. I wanted to press you in a couple of things which are directly related. First, I think perhaps you walk it too quickly, my understanding of what is a central element in the criticism to the no demos thesis, which is specifically the reliance on sociological conditions, empirical sociological conditions that totally predate the constitution of a demos. And I think that was an essential question, particularly when addressed to Dieter Grimm, that I think was the one who formulated this thesis in the thicker possible way. So that was a central question that you passed through in a very kind of I would say shallow ways. I would like you to perhaps deepen this criticism and express your arguments on the sociological reliance on sociological empirical dimension that totally pre-democratic. And connected to that, I was surprised that you didn't reflect on something which is very specific of the European Union construction. That with all the imperfections that the construction may have, is the only case in which the potential demos, and I'm not speaking of a real demos, but the potential hypothetical demos, bypasses the basic dilemma that is behind the democratic theory, which is the democratic constitution of the demos. So you could speak that even though it's a very imperfect and non-finished process of construction, nevertheless, there is a consent on the part of the different participants in the demos to be part of that demos. In that respect, the European Union adds something to democratic theory that perhaps I didn't see so strongly reflected in your theory, and I would like you to revise. And finally, the third point that I would like to raise in connection to the previous second point is what is your reflection of the implications of constructing this more, let's say, cosmopolitan argument in relation to the boundaries of the demos itself. What I mean is that if we are really serious about the construction of the demos in this respect, there is no normative ground to restrict that to a given context which is predefined as the European Union, and rather the theoretical construction projects you to a real cosmopolitan global dimension. Otherwise, you kind of slip into a kind of incoherent construction because you defend a cosmopolitan construction that is restricted to a very specific regional setting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Yes, I think so. I at some point I wouldn't have taken this approach to the paper. I wouldn't have actually written anything about the no demos thesis if I thought that it was just a historical thing, right? So this is not a paper about revising a thesis that was important at some point. So for me, it was key to read these recent papers by Richard Bellamy and seeing that some people are still convinced by this thesis, right? And then that was surprising, and maybe that's only the problem of Richard Bellamy, I don't know. But I thought that it still attracted some people, and then I thought that it might be worth considering it. So I agree with you, and I should certainly emphasize some things that I didn't mention now in the presentation for reasons of time. And particularly, I think, I mean, as you said, I think it's important, and I think this I already mentioned, it's important that this construction of a European demos needs to be done through the consensus, through the consent of the peoples of the different states. I think that is absolutely crucial, and as you said, that might be perhaps not a solution to the ultimate paradox, but anyway, it's a good attempt actually to deal with the paradox in an interesting way, right? So I totally agree with that. And regarding the last point, regarding the cosmopolitan thing, I also agree. I think, so I come actually from working on global democracy. And I still work on that, right? So that's my main interest right now. And I occasionally write something on Europe, but it's not my main field. As you can imagine, right, trying to defend the idea of global democracy, which is a very minoritarian idea. I think that there are only 5 people in the world who might defend this. I'm exaggerating, but I mean, my usual the reaction I always find is always very shocking. And then coming from that level, right, when I approached the idea of constructing a European democracy, I thought, you know, I mean, everything is fine here. I mean, there's no problem at all, right? Because many conditions are already given, at least to some extent, etc. Among them, the sociological conditions that you mentioned, I think that they are given in the sense that they are preconditions, right? They are already given. In the sense that they are contributing conditions to the quality, maybe not all of them are given to a sufficient threshold, but then my response is, let's go, right? Let's start walking and we will reinforce democracy in the future. But yes, I agree. My ultimate aspiration in the end is for defending global democracy. But of course, global democracy is fully compatible with having regional governments, with having local governments, right? And all these levels of government must be democratic. That's my point. So yes, I think that the logic that underlines my approach is global in the end. But I think that is compatible with claiming for having European democracy.
Well, thank you again to the intervention of both of our speakers, José Luis Martí, Adriana Chancho, and of course to all of you for your questions. What remains now is the task of summarizing both days' activities and thoughts. So we will pass now to the closing remarks by Ander Erasti and Cristina Astier. We'll continue straight through, so your patience now, and we'll get straight started. Round of applause for our speakers.